Ladies and gentlemen, it's David Hall here, founder and chief executive of the Ideas Centre, and here to share with you a technique which focuses entirely on problem scoping, making sure that the problem owner has absolute clarity on what their problem is before they rush in and try and solve it. And the technique is described as multiple questioning. Now, if someone comes to me as a creative facilitator with a problem that they can't solve, asking for an injection of some new creative thinking, my start point will be to doubt whether or not they've got the correct definition of the problem in the first instance, because we tend to rush in and solve a problem before we necessarily understand it. So I suggest that we use a scoping technique, sitting down one-on-one, not to try and solve the problem, but to make sure we've got the very best definition of the problem in the first instance. We are rubbish at problem definition. We tend to leap into left brain or second stage thinking where we try and solve the problem. And if we can't solve it, we get stuck. The trick when you cannot solve a problem is rather counterintuitive. You want to step away, and rather than trying to solve it, you want to use right brain thinking, which is all about problem exploration. And it's nothing to do with solving the problem whatsoever, and everything to do with understanding the problem to get the very best definition. Any scoping technique, and there are a range of these techniques, is what I would refer to as a coffee cup technique. They take 15-20 minutes absolute maximum on a one-on-one basis. Now the technique works like this. The creative facilitator is equipped with a multiple questioning matrix which has within it 22 different probes or prompts, and the facilitator will use those prompts to generate questions to ask of the problem owner. The essential thing is that the facilitator needs to be playing a naive role without any in-depth understanding of what the problem is to add maximum value to the process. And what they will do over a cup of coffee is work through each of these probes, using each one to try and generate some fresh thinking for the problem owner, providing them with an insight into what the real problem might be. The top tip is to start from the top left-hand corner and work down, then move in a column, then work down, then move in a column and work down. And in each of these boxes, the facilitator will take the prompt and try and form a question of the problem owner to help them clarify and explore what the problem is all about. So, by way of example, the first of the boxes, top left, is more or less of something. So whatever the problem is, and let's assume our problem here is increasing profit. So we're working with a chief exec and their desire is to boost the profitability of the business. The creative facilitator must use the prompt, more or less of something, to try and shed some fresh light on what the problem is all about in the first instance, try and unpick it. So what I would do as a creative facilitator is ask the problem owner, so what is it you want more of and what is it you want less of? Perhaps trivially, the problem owner might say we want to increase sales and we want to reduce costs. Notice that if your problem is increasing sales, that's a very different problem definition from simply we want to increase profit. And equally, reducing costs is different again. So depending on how you define a problem determines entirely how you go about solving it. Instantly, with one probe, we've shed fresh light on what this problem might be all about. Now, such a trivial response might come from the problem owner really quite quickly, and the speed of their response is indicative of the fact it's coming from the pre-wired left-hand side of the brain. And by documenting this, we're adding really relatively little value. The facilitator should constantly be in search of what I refer to as the middle distance stare, where the problem owner has to stop a second and think hard, and they kind of stare into the sky as they're pondering, which is a clear indication that they're then using the right-hand side of the brain, exploring less familiar territory. It's now that the facilitator is about to unearth a little golden nugget of value with a fresh thought probed by the facilitator but delivered by the problem owner. And it's this that needs to be captured by the facilitator in the space available underneath that probe. So the facilitator probes further around those trivial, rapid-fire responses from the problem owner. And we might say you want to increase sales, but what is it you really want more of? And it might be that the managing director, chief exec says we want more cold calls. Well, more cold calls is very different from wanting to increase sales, which is very different from increasing profit. So we really are beginning to unpick this. You want to reduce costs. What is it you want less of or more of? Well, we want to increase productivity and we want to reduce our material costs. Well, these again are completely fresh problem statements. So as a facilitator, I'll just capture those notes in that particular box. We've got 22 of these boxes, so there are 22 different probes that we want to use over a cup of coffee that will take probably no longer than 22 minutes. So we've got about a minute per box. Next box, moving quite quickly, attitude, behaviour or deed. So what are the problems that sit underneath a lack of cold calls, and search for that middle distance stare. The problem owner might say we're not making enough cold calls. That's a deed, that's the outcome of the task. What's the behaviour that underpins that? Well, it's poor time management. Okay, so that's a different take on what the problem might be. And what's the attitude that leads to that poor time management? Well, it might be that the sales team don't like making cold calls. Well, that's a completely fresh understanding of what the problem is about. So by using these probes quite skillfully, we start to really unpick what this underlying real problem is all about. Ends or means? It's interesting, we tend to express a problem in terms of the means, the mechanism for achieving an end, rather than the end itself. So with increasing profit, is that an end or is it a means? And one might argue it's an end, but if your real problem is generating cash, then actually increasing profit is just a means by which you might achieve that. If the real problem is increasing cash, then let's say so and let's focus our creativity in that area there. The aim of this exercise is to work through all 22 boxes, and they tend to shift to the softer cultural issues as you move further to the right. Now, the facilitator manages the time and fills in as many of the boxes as possible in whatever time is available. So if you can't complete all 22, not a major issue. At the end of the exercise, the facilitator merely asks the question of the problem owner, scanning over the whole range of boxes. What's the real problem that you've got here? What's the real problem you've got here? And then there's a debate between the problem owner and the facilitator, scanning over these various boxes to identify what the problem as defined is, the real problem, which must always start with the words how can, because any statement starting with a how can must finish with a question mark. It must be a problem statement. We're rubbish at problem statements. What we often do is just give a statement that isn't a problem definition and assume the listener can work out what the associated problem is. That's a poor assumption to make. That is not helpful here when it comes to problem solving. Effectively, what we're doing is using those 22 questions to probe the brain from different directions. The problem owner will typically be using their patterned behaviour from past experience to understand what the problem is. And what this technique does is use 22 probing questions to come at the problem from completely different perspectives, to try and unpick the problem, never trying to solve it. And each of these questions comes from a completely external source, taking no account of those prior patterns. And the use of a skilled, naive facilitator ensures that you get maximum added value out of these particular probes. I've got 6 in the schematic here. Don't forget there are 22. This is a 3-dimensional space that we're operating in rather than 2-dimensional. So we get good coverage to give us the very best problem definition at the end. Cool technique.